Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Youssef, we haven't talked since the 60th anniversary. It's November and we're already heading into March. So that's time goes by very, very quickly. But I wanted to get I wanted to catch up with you, but I really wanted to get your understanding of why do you believe certain individuals were involved in the Kennedy assassination? What have you seen that has shown you that it's, in your belief, I think, rogue elements of the CIA, which I think a lot of people have come to the agreement that that's the safe basis.
Yeah. I mean, well, yeah, pleasure to be back on Out of the Blank, Robbie. And yeah, it's. I mean, my background. I've been researching obviously this book on really David Atlee Phillips, but you can't look at these characters in isolation. They existed within a clique, a circle of high-profile, infamous covert operatives. Such as James Angleton, William King, Harvey, Alan Dulles, Richard Helms. And I've been researching Phillips particularly and that wider story of almost kind of a group biography over the past few years. Like you, I've had kind of a hobby horse interest in this subject going back much further. Yeah, I mean, I think that there are obviously many schools, many churches, if you like, of thinking on the subject. There are still, people out there who are very prominent in the research community still pushing the Oswald did it, the lone assassin kind of line, people like Gerald Posner et al. So, yeah, I think it's, for me, the starting point is really that as much as there are so many different aspects and areas that require real specialist expertise when you're talking about forensics, ballistics, etc. I think if you're just kind of trying to start from first principles and you're looking at it, in terms of the kind of witness testimony from Dealey Plaza, the testimony from Parkland Hospital staff, doctors, nurses, what you see with your own eyes, common sense wise on the Zapruder film, the fact that the headshot looks like it's not coming from behind, the throat shot is very likely from in front. I think once you put all of that together, the timing of the shots as per the kind of clock on the Zapruder film, I think it's very hard to not arrive at the same conclusion as the US government in their final investigation back in 1979, the House investigation. I'll just label it that in brief, concluded that this was a probable conspiracy and that it involved two gunmen. I think at least, that's a conservative estimate. I think you that's your starting point. I think in the year 2024, the question then becomes what shape did this conspiracy take? Was it a high level conspiracy? Did this involve the kind of people both you and I are interested in, from the CIA, perhaps from military intelligence, something like ACSI, Army intelligence as well? Or was it more of a kind of low-level conspiracy? Was this just involving Cuban exiles, mafiosi, And I think the key point to start with is that all of these people, as we know, were working together in Operation Mongoose. So it's almost a bit of a red herring to say, was it the Cuban exiles? Was it the mafia? Was it, the CIA? Was it the military? All of these elements were heavily involved in what was really the biggest, Mongoose was the biggest operation in a communist country, namely, of course, Cuba. So this was a huge operation involving, huge amounts of funding, resources. It had been authorized by the Kennedy brothers. But what was going on in the southern states, in Florida, where of course the kind of Miami JM Wave station was running it, but also in other states such as Texas and Louisiana, was a lot of off the books, pretty dark stuff going on in terms of gun running and contraband and so forth. So there was essentially what Lyndon Johnson would later describe as we were running a damned murder ring. Essentially, it was a group of completely out of control operatives, assassins, dodgy kind of cops, FBI people. So there was a lot of crazy stuff going on that I think even I've spoken to an ex-CIA station chief from a later era. Even from their perspective, they look back on this kind of Wild West era and they say this was completely out of control stuff that was going on. In the words of Ted Shackley, the kind of infamous blonde ghost who was running the Miami station, it was a funny time. He said as he's quoted, there was a strange air, with all the assassinations business that was going on at that time. So it was as if anything and everything was possible and was on the cards. In the words of JFK's own Secretary of State Dean Rusk, the Kennedys were playing with fire. And so the idea that this entire apparatus, this entire mechanism that was being directed against Fidel Castro, that somehow that mechanism then got turned actually against Kennedy himself, it's not actually a long shot once you know the context of all of this. And I think if you look at, David Phillips, who I'm particularly interested in, Phillips was at the time based in Mexico City. He was chief of covert operations and then was promoted to becoming kind of chief of Cuban operations at that time in Mexico City. He later rose to becoming a station chief, and beyond that became the number 3 in the agency. He became chief of Western Hemisphere operations for the CIA.
So he was a writer before all that, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, his background is fascinating. So he's a bit of an outsider when if you buy into the idea that the agency was kind of really run by kind of this old boys network, the likes of Alan Dulles, perhaps Richard Helms, Frank Wisner, Cord Meyer, Tracy Barnes. These were kind of WASP, Ivy League types. And they were all part of this kind of, Angleton as well. I think he went to Yale. They were all part of this Georgetown set. So there was this kind of matrix of politicians, intelligence people, journalists, etc., etc. And they were all kind of in Georgetown, in Washington, in DC, and they were all going to each other's, parties and cocktailians and what have you, rubbing shoulders. And Phillips, like some of the other kind of, I guess, mid-level characters we'll come across, David Morales, Bill Harvey, they were outsiders, really, to this. So Phillips was a Texan. He was from Fort Worth. His dad died when he was very young, brought up by his mum alongside his siblings. He was, by all accounts, brave, courageous. He'd fought in the war. He'd been, in fact, POW under the Nazis in a rather brutal German camp. Escaped twice, and then decided to move to Chile with his first wife, Helen, and essentially got recruited there by the CIA. But his background, you're right, he'd been a writer, he'd been kind of a playwright, he'd got an option with a stipend that he lived off for a while, nearly almost kind of made it, well, it was almost going to become an off-Broadway production, I think, off the top of my head, but then the plans kind of got scuppered by I think it was the kind of much more famous version that was made by others. Of course, that was I think it was called, was it Stalag 51, I want to say, but that could be wrong. It could be another number. But that became the more famous play, and Phillips often kind of mused on what would have happened to his life and career if actually his play had kind of taken off. But yeah, he was kind of a frustrated writer and actor, in fact, and he continued his kind of amateur dramatics throughout his life, often playing in kind of these amateur productions wherever he was living, and he was often on the move with colleagues. And in fact, what's very interesting is that those kind of extracurricular skills, if you like, became incredibly useful in his career as a spy. The kind of ability to kind of to engage in kind of deception, even self-deception, to play a role. Phillips, throughout his life, was often kind of under deep cover. For example, in Cuba during the Revolutionary War, he was effectively resigned from the agency and was pretending to be a public relations, running a PR agency called David Phillips, I think, Associates, in Havana. So yeah, very interesting how these kind of various areas. He, in fact, also, whilst he was in Chile in the early 1950s, he bought or purchased a local newspaper, the South Pacific Mail, which actually had it was the largest English kind of newspaper, had the largest English newspaper circulation, I think, in the kind of what the CIA calls the cone, kind of southern part of Latin America. So
Do you believe he just had
Chile,
an interest
Argentina,
in writing
Uruguay.
still? Is that why he kept up the newspaper stuff? He just had an interest still, or do you believe that it was a propaganda type of operation that was still going on? I mean, you have to think if you have someone that has the resources and means. I mean, not to use the example of Howard Hughes, but guy's a billionaire and he hates communists. I mean, that's a profile for the government that they would love to get their hands on and really develop a relationship with. So I'm curious. I mean, who was the main ringleader out of the group that you would point at as like, because you mentioned Cuban exiles, and I've seen so many documents about rogue Cuban exiles. Even Lyndon Johnson said he believed it was Cuban exiles that killed or took the shot at Kennedy, where I go, okay, we can say it's Cuba and then we can start blaming Castro, or we can just say, didn't the people like Harvey and others do operations that involved Cubans, exiles on our side doing these covert operations? So wouldn't we point to because I don't think the Cubans, a small group, would try and do something like that, knowing the full force of the U.S. government's probably going to be coming down on their head. I mean, if you look at the assassination, what happens after? There's what you get Oswald shot and killed, and then it's all over with. Everyone just kind of goes about their day. I mean, there's memorial services and things like that, but the American government starts moving. I go, in any other situation, they would have locked up Oswald's family. They would have done anything if there wasn't some type of agreement behind that. You know what I'm saying? So that's what you really have to look at. But to the Cuban exile question,
Yeah. I mean, I think you're bang on. I think it's almost unthinkable that either Cuban exiles or mafia would try to pull off a presidential assassination without, authorization much higher up, and that really becomes probably the key question of the Kennedy assassination. Here we are, 60 years on and counting. Who really gave authorization for this? Who were the kind of architects of this operation? And I think, of course, we'll never know, because if you go to William Harvey's notes, you've got to remember the reason we suspect people like William King Harvey, Bill Harvey, as he's often referred to, is that Harvey was running ZR Rifle, the CIA's assassination program that was being directed against Castro and other world leaders. So Harvey, was completely immersed in the assassinations business, and we have his handwritten notes on how to run an assassination. And guess what? Those notes have striking parallels with the JFK assassination. So, this is a hell of a coincidence. You've got in Harvey's notes all this stuff about basically using a fake 201 file that is run through Angleton's counterintelligence division on an eyes-only basis. So basically, that's precisely what happened with Oswald. We have a 201 file. It was, Oswald himself was well known to James Jesus Angleton, the CIA's chief of counterintelligence's team, specifically his what was known as the Special Intelligence Group. So, this is going back to 1959, to his defection to Russia. Angleton's team know all about Oswald. In fact, they're opening his mother's mail. So, this is through Angleton's HT Lingual mail opening program. So, this is that aspect. Harvey in his notes talks about using kind of blaming the Soviets or the Czechs, he says, for assassinations. He talks about using underworld assets, specifically Corsicans rather than Sicilians, so it can't be traced back to the kind of the kind of American Italian mafia. So it talks about the Corsicans, and of course Harvey was in charge of the CIA component of Mongoose. So not only was he in charge of ZR Rifle, he was in charge of the CIA part of Mongoose, and then he fell out with the Kennedys, so he kind of had a motive. He had an intense hatred of them. He was, very scathing, according to others, about Bobby Kennedy in particular. Saw him as a kind of trumped up, arrogant kind of so and so. And basically Bobby Kennedy falls out with him because of the fact that Bill Harvey's effectively, effectively, during the missile crisis, he didn't follow orders and was basically carrying out covert operations that could have kind of potentially escalated into could have been misinterpreted by the Russians as being something hostile or aggressive. And so when Bobby Kennedy found out that he was basically disobeying orders and edicts from the White House, he fired him. Helms did something very interesting. He moved him quietly to Rome, where Harvey became station chief in Rome,
As a
chief of
punishment.
station. Yeah, as punishment. And of course, his career was effectively over, and he therefore never forgave the Kennedys. But he remained, interestingly, still, well into 1963, involved in kind of Cuban operations, Mongoose, even ZR Rifle. And there's some very interesting stuff that was dug up in documents about kind of Harvey's expenses and his movements in the summer, in even, I think, the kind of towards the fall of 1963, which begs, a lot of questions about what he was doing. There's stuff about him, down in Florida. He's at, various hotels which have, forget their names now, but quite a shady, they have quite a shady provenance. He was in a motel, I think in the Keys. I think it was it Plantation Motel or something like that. Anyway, he's staying in a room there. Next door is another room which appears to be in, I think, Johnny Roselli's name. So Johnny Roselli was a high-profile mafiosi, very interesting character who had once worked for the kind of Al Capone's crew. He'd,
If I'm not mistaken, he slept with Marilyn Monroe.
Yeah, he may well have done. You probably know more about him than I do.
That's why they gave him Handsome Johnny. Apparently, he was a swinger back in his day.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the name. That might be the name of one of his biographies, even. But
I like it when you Google his name. He was chopped up and put in a barrel off the coast of like what was it, Florida or something like that.
yeah, I
And
believe so. Miami.
if you look up Google and how he died, he said he died of asphyxiation. I was like, I'm pretty sure once the arms and legs are gone, that's how he dies. But Google's just like, nah, asphyxiation is how he went. But you mentioned when we're
Well,
talking,
interesting. I think the coroner found that although it looked like a mafia hit job, I think the coroner's investigation found that some kind of paralytic agent had been administered prior, which is very odd. That doesn't sound so much like a mafia hit job once you start to look at things like that. So yeah.
it's you mentioned something about Harvey, but I think we should give a little background. I mean, to believe what the agency's mentality was back then, maybe we kind of started discussing it a little bit in the beginning about this fraternity type that's involved in there. But also when you're fired, you're not really fired. And I think that's background for a lot of people where it's like, what do you mean? If they get fired, they're out of the job. I'm like, well, Alan Dulles was sitting at a farm still directing and doing motives. I mean, these guys are old school, not elite types, but they're high up in their positions, mostly because they've done things that the agency can't just let you just leave or quit or get fired from. They have to have some type of contact with you until whenever they need you again, you get drawn back in. But I think a lot of people don't know that when it comes to some of these operations. I mean, from the operations you've seen, from assassination stuff we've already talked about earlier on Fidel Castro, but to other things like when it comes to Operation Northwoods and other various areas, these operations kind of give you a bigger background to understanding why people would suspect that the U.S. government had involvement in something like the Kennedy assassination.
Yeah, well, exactly. It's that. I mean, first of all, I think that term, the U.S. government, it's slightly misleading, isn't it? Because the question is, who really knew what happened? There's the actual assassination kind of conspiracy, the people who were, pre-assassination involved, and I think in the year 2024, I mean, even in the year 1979, I don't think the likes of Angleton, Dulles, Helms, any of them. I mean, by then Dulles was dead, but any of them could have possibly imagined the amount of information and declassification and release of documents. And right now we have about 4.5 million pages. That, of course, not all of it directly related to the assassination, but indirectly, it is certainly the point about the assassination is it's this kind of postmodern moment, and it's linked to all these things we've been talking about, and hence this sheer kind of massive amount of paperwork and documentation on it. And it's been likened to kind of a jigsaw the size of a kind of a football pitch. And I would add to that we don't even have all the pieces. So, it's this billion piece jigsaw, and it's we don't even have all the pieces to be able to put it together correctly. But we are a hell of a lot, I think, further down the line than anyone could have possibly envisaged or anticipated, and that any of these covert operators would have wanted to see that kind of amount. I mean, Richard Helms died not that long ago. It was about 20 years ago, I think 2002, 2003. And before that, he released his memoirs. And Helms was a real kind of keeper of the secrets, as his biographer labeled him. He was, up there with kind of, I think, Lyman Kirkpatrick in terms of really keeping secrets in a way that perhaps some of his colleagues didn't. So, yeah, I think going back to your question, I would say the way that this was, when you look at particularly Oswald's biography, Oswald's profile, the whole Mexico City business, if you're familiar with it, for those who are kind of listening. I mean, when you look at all of that, it's an incredible design to the plot that essentially kind of almost works like a bit like one of those kind of Russian dolls, where it's just layer after layer that's unpeeled. And I think, the initial thing is, oh my God, this guy Oswald, lone nut, has killed the president. Guess what? He's a pro-Castro kind of Marxist communist who was living in the Soviet Union. Well, wow, that's convenient, isn't it? It's a hell of a boon for all those kind of Cold Warriors and all those, Pentagon and CIA people who want to invade, Cuba and topple Castro. And then, the next layer, I think, beyond that, almost immediately, the likes of Lyndon Johnson, who's now, of course, president, he's now the incumbent in the White House, J. Edgar Hoover, is, oh my God, this guy was down in Mexico City and he was hobnobbing, consorting with the Russians and the Cubans in their, consulates and embassies a few weeks before the assassination. Oh my God, is this a communist, conspiracy? This could lead to kind of nuclear war, to Armageddon. We'd better, hush this all up. And we've got that. We've got the tapes of Johnson and Hoover, giving Johnson the kind of lowdown on this. And that's the conclusion they arrive at. And I think if you listen then to, later testimony that came out from, I think it was the guy whom Helms appointed to run the CIA's internal investigation of the assassination before Angleton kind of took over, before Angleton and Rocker took over as the kind of liaison to the Warren Commission, was a guy, whose name, this is what happens when you're middle-aged, Robbie, your memory just becomes shot, but it's probably information overload. But anyway, it's a guy whose code name was John Celso, I think. So I think he's Whitten, John Whitten, code name Celso. So he says, I think it was him who said, the effect, on the afternoon, inside the agency, on the afternoon of the assassination, when it was revealed that Oswald was the alleged assassin, was just electric. And I think that's because, in fact, as one other CIA personnel from I think the Tokyo station testified, because Oswald was known to them. He was known as some kind of asset, whether it was an unwitting or a witting asset. He was known to them, and that's why the effect was electric, because this was like, oh my God, this is someone who is connected directly to the intelligence community and is being accused of murdering the president of the United States. So that's kind of the next layer beyond is this a communist conspiracy, was, oh my God, this is someone connected to us. And I think that it was that moment which really leads to the kind of chilling effect, of completely dampening out any desire on the part of the broader US government apparatus to investigate this. And I think all of that was very cleverly built into the plot by its architects, by the people who designed it. And I think when you look at it, that it's of course, it was a traumatic, very dark moment for the United States and in fact the world. But you almost have to take your hat off, because whoever did this was kind of a mastermind, was really a malevolent genius. Whoever was able to use Oswald as a kind of patsy and to design the plot in that way, basically guaranteed that there would be no investigation, no serious investigation. And you've got to look at Bill Harvey's reaction. According to his deputy in the Rome station, Mark Wyatt, Harvey's reaction was, nobody will ever know. That's what he said on the day. He demonstrated that he actually, and what he apparently confided to Wyatt on the day, he demonstrated foreknowledge of the assassination before it happened. He said something along the lines of, this is the day when the goddamn president's going to get himself killed. And then when he was told about the news, he said, well, this was always bound to happen, and it's probably a good thing it did. And later on, he said, no one will ever work out who did it. So, I think Harvey's definitely a prime candidate. If you accept these comments from Mark Wyatt, and I don't think there's any reason why, professionals such as him are just going to make this stuff up. I think it'd be very strange unless you had some kind of vendetta to just invent these kind of quotes. But of course, I understand the position that hearsay and so on.
Yeah, but how much weight do you put in quotes like that? We have Truman's quotes about talking about how the CIA has kind of diverged from what their initial kind of creation was about. I mean, you have all these random quotes, like Nixon making quotes about, we don't want to repeat the Bay of Pigs fiasco. I mean, there's a lot of weird things that come out of these people in positions of power, whether it's just a slip of the tongue or they're leaving by hints or notes of people to question. I mean, when Dag Hammarskjöld's killed, you have Truman saying, he was on the verge of getting something done when they killed him. Notice how I said they killed him. And nobody follows up with that, like just no press questions or anything like that. It makes you wonder, like if Helms can lie in court and you have these agencies, what is their extent to what they can do? And they obviously don't operate under the law. Any of these individuals do. So then do we accept testimony and documentation on the basis of what they were saying in court if we've known that they've lied in the past? I mean, you have to rationalize every decision or every perspective you have going forward on something with evidence from the past. And I think you can rationalize a lot of government operations that were going on to get you to the level of they could just flip this on to the president.
Yeah. I mean, I think for all of us as mere mortals, the kind of morality and the ethics that govern most of our lives, and in fact govern the workings of the system most of the time. If you're talking about the kind of official government and its various agencies and the law courts and so on, of course, there may be, corruption and malfeasance and so on, but most of the time, these things operate in a fairly, normal, rational way. But in fact, I think what you discover through this history of covert operations going back decades is that, as you've pointed out, that there is a nexus, a network between government, certain politicians, into some of the kind of intelligence operatives, extending into, the military, extending into, what obviously Eisenhower christened as a military-industrial complex, but extending beyond that into the kind of corporate financial sphere. There is undoubtedly a powerful network or nexus of, groups of people and organizations even that have been involved in some very shady stuff, and they've clearly, had a huge amount of impact and influence on kind of both domestic and world affairs. Now, I think one way of trying to kind of understand this structurally is it's kind of like what's labeled a dual state. Of course, the term deep state is often, derided, I think perhaps, somewhat unfairly by the kind of liberal mainstream who just deride all of this stuff, including the Kennedy assassination, and as just conspiracy theory. And that's, I think previously we've touched on that label. There's probably no need to kind of go down that avenue just now. But, dual state, I think, is a very good way of formulating this, where you have this tension between the kind of overt, legitimate government or state and these kind of more hidden, secretive, shady elements. And of course, the Kennedy assassination was probably the first, not the first operation by any means. There was a lot of dodgy stuff going on in the late 40s and in the 50s in the United States. But I think it's the first public worldwide event that leads, it's a kind of watershed moment, because over the ensuing years and decades, it is really the starting point at which people began to realize that there was something much bigger, much darker, much deeper going on. And that stuff obviously was later exposed in the 1970s, wasn't it? A lot of it, a lot of what we now associate with these outfits was exposed during those 1970s investigations. But yeah, to go back to your point, I think, for our own morality, our own ethics, it beggars belief that something like this could be carried out by these kind of highly respectable men in suits. You watch footage of these people, when they were being subpoenaed for or brought, forced to testify, the likes of Helms or Angleton, or even Bill Harvey, David Phillips, and they just looked like completely respectable, decent people, but they were they were up to their knees in a lot of this very dark stuff. Whether it was the kind of your own hobby horse MK Ultra and the mind control programs, which Helms ordered. He wanted everything, all the files to be destroyed, didn't he? And it's only because I think they found some documents that we only know about the program, don't we? Because only just by accident, some documents didn't get destroyed, and I think they were found in a cabinet somewhere or whatever. Otherwise, it's the same with Northwoods. We wouldn't know about Northwoods if it wasn't for the the assassination, the ARB in the 90s, the Records Review Board that was constituted in the wake of the kind of outcry over Oliver Stone's JFK. So, there's a lot of stuff we presumably don't even know about that's been, long destroyed and forgotten and may never ever be revealed. But yeah, I think it's very hard to get from our empirical viewpoint and mindset. It's very hard to understand that they would carry something like this out. And I think that is the first question that I said, the kind of linchpin key question is, how high did this conspiracy go? And I think that, one of the other key questions is, well, why did they do it? I mean, was there really no other option apart from assassinating JFK? And I think those are both, very extremely difficult questions to answer. You kind of wonder why they didn't choose alternatives. But I think you've got to understand that these were very powerful people who basically, are used to running the empire, are used to kind of, take someone like Alan Dulles. And as you say, even once he was fired alongside Charles Cabell and Richard Bissell, Dick Bissell, once he was fired, he didn't just go away kind of quietly into the night. He maintained his position effectively as an exile CIA chief. And if you look at his diaries, he was meeting the good, the bad, and the ugly, on a regular basis in his Georgetown, his Georgetown townhouse. And he was meeting with even, the likes of JFK's defense secretary, Robert McNamara. He was meeting with, his old clique who were ever loyal to him, the likes of Frank Wisner and Angleton, and I think Helms, but Cordmeyer. I think a lot of these people were still meeting with Dulles during that period. And as you say, on the what obviously David Talbot discovered was that in his diaries he was at the farm, which was a CIA. This was on the day of the assassination. He was at the farm, which is a CIA kind of, kind of. I don't know how would you describe it. It's kind of a CIA, not exactly base, but an entire facility. That's the word I'm looking for. It's a facility, I think, in Virginia that was used for kind of training, and that's where Dulles was on the day of his assassination, which is odd. But yeah, I mean, I think when you look at Bill Harvey's, going back to his handwritten notes, one of the things he says is nothing on paper. So, there wasn't, if these people ever met to discuss how to do this, there's never going to be a document with any of this written on it. This was obviously carried out the one thing that is carried out in the most secretive way is assassinations, and it was plausibly deniable. Yeah, I think you can trace it as far as those mid-level operatives. I think what you see with Harvey, and you've got to remember that out in Rome, he wasn't actually in exile. Harvey would have therefore been plugged into Gladio networks. And we know that Harvey went on these appears to have, according to his biographer and CIA colleague Bayard Stockton, he was often out in Europe. This was even before he got demoted, investigating, trying to recruit underworld assets in the US and in Europe and elsewhere. So he was plugged into that world. And what the Kennedys didn't know, it's quite likely the Kennedys didn't even know that Gladio existed. It was kept secret from presidents, prime ministers. In fact, I think at least one NATO one NATO supreme commander as well. So he would have been plugged into Gladio, which was a pretty dark business as well. And I think that brings us on to some of the other perhaps mid-level or senior officers such as Phillips and Angleton. And I think again there's a lot of circumstantial and compelling evidence that they were either involved or knew a lot more than they were letting on about what happened.
When it comes to some of the subversive tactics that have been done to really keep this case going on for 60-something years, in particular focused towards the research community, obviously, if you print up a lot of documentation, it's going to be damn near impossible to come out with a perfect conclusion. I mean, how many documents get called fakes or they get called this? And it's just really good way to be able to hide and cover your ass or have people researching for 60-something years and really not necessarily being at the start, but not really getting down to the core issues of things. I think a lot has been revealed by the community. I think it's great, but if you're going to spark up a new generation into looking into the assassination, I mean, how do you get them to the basis to understand that this is one giant subversive tactic? Everything by the intelligence community from whatever direction that they were heading in has been employed, not only in the actual event, but also in the years following of keeping this thing secret. I mean, we see media tactics with it. A number of people like David Talbot that wrote a newspaper article for, I forgot, was the New York Post, and they took it down or something like that because a week before it was supposed to go up because they were like, they didn't want to touch the Kennedy subject. And it was like, well, I thought we're like, this is a leftist paper. We should be putting this out there. And then he wrote a whole thing for Salon about it, but there's been various tactics that we've come out, Operation Mockingbird, certain news individuals that were just incentivized not to dig into the story if they wanted to get either exclusives with interviews with family members or people that were directly involved in there. So it's not like saying everybody's in on this giant conspiracy. We all hate JFK. We're all in on this. This is more like there's a lot of people that know how to leverage power. And there's people that, if you want to talk about why would these individuals do the act, well, imagine being like how Hoover was, and everyone's scared of you because you got blackmail or something on them. Well, it's in their best interest to defend Hoover whenever something bad comes up about him. Eventually, these things start happening. Allen Dulles, whatever command he respected or people feared him, when he gets fired, well, now you've pissed off the whole agency. That is basically the image of Allen Dulles.
Yeah, I mean, so much material there too, so much to discuss. I think, yeah, I mean, Dulles, I think the Kennedys were unfortunate. The way I think they went about doing business made a lot of enemies. They made enemies of the mafia. They made enemies of the top hierarchy of the CIA, of the Pentagon. The Cuban exiles never forgave them, alongside the others over the Bay of Pigs. So they made a lot of enemies, and I think that's the one thing that made it possible to pull this off. I think that was part of the kind of calculation, is knowing, and of course Hoover, yeah, as you mentioned, I think the Kennedys and Hoover hated each other's guts. So basically, they made enemies of a large part of the American establishment, and whoever the kind of likely powerful, influential people who are involved in the assassination, as distinct from the cover-up. You've mentioned, of course, the American media, very different actually from the kind of European response, which was much more cynical and skeptical and accepting of the idea that there might well have been a conspiracy. And I think Alan Dulles even talks about this in the Warren Commission kind of executive sessions, where he says European conspiracies, European assassinations are conspiracies. American assassinations are just the work of lone assassins. And I think one of the other commissioners basically contradicts him and says, well, the Lincoln assassination wasn't a lone assassin. And he says, well, it was, John Wilkes Booth was overwhelmingly the dominant conspirator, to the point that it might as well have been a lone assassin or something.
Didn't Alan Dulles put that in his book? He said that every assassination throughout history has been done by a lone assassin, except the Abraham Lincoln assassination.
I haven't. You're referring to the Craft of Intelligence, maybe. I've got that. Yeah. I haven't read it because it looks like it's quite a dry book about tradecraft. So
I mean, there is something interesting in it, which is that they have the terminate with extreme prejudice, which was about ways that you can make death or assassination or just murder look like an accident, whether it's like if you can, and it just gives you kind of a base description of how, if a person falls from this, you got to do this and you got to do this. And that's when I point to people when people are like, well, the government just doesn't go around killing people. I was like, true, they don't just randomly kill people, but there is things where they've lied about it. And I think if you know that they've made cases like the Frank Olson scenario, where the government really tried to wipe their hands with that, and it's been proven now that the government has paid them a large sum of money because new information has come out about the Frank Olson death, and his whole son did a documentary for it, for Netflix that you can watch. I go, then you have to start being like, I do not believe when they tell me something. Like if they say, hey, yeah, we didn't take out that guy, his car just blew up. I'm like, I agree. Sure, I believe you, but I also don't, because I don't know what you've done in the past and how far your hands are involved in a lot of nefarious things.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, exactly. Yeah. I mean, it becomes kind of guilt by kind of association. I mean, what's very interesting is that you look at, I think there's a CIA document from I think it's 1967, at the height of the Garrison investigation. And it was kind of a memo sent out to kind of media assets about, here are some lines to use for countering this idea that there was a conspiracy. And, one of them is that,
1095 360 is the document number.
Right, there we are. Yeah.
Where they first used the word conspiracy in a document, saying call these people conspiracists or conspiracy theorists.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the one, isn't it? You've got a Win Scott kind of memory there, clearly for documents. And yeah, I mean that document, they talk about various things such as, well, no one would choose Oswald, someone as unstable, a kind of psychological profile as Oswald, and a wealthy group of conspirators would never choose this kind of way of killing. And I think these are actually very valid, interesting points, because as Robin Ramsey, who's actually a fellow Brit and is the co-founder, co-editor, I think, of Lobster, very interesting magazine. I don't know if you've come across it. I mean, one of his kind of almost devil's advocate style arguments is, you look at the way this was carried out, and it's a bushwhack. This is very strange. If this was a high level conspiracy, and I think there's every chance that it is. How extensively high level, I don't know, but I think there's every chance that this goes up to the likes of Dulles and Helms and so on. But he makes this very kind of devil's advocate kind of compelling argument that, well, if this was a high level conspiracy that involved, possibly, people in military intelligence as well as the CIA, then why on earth would they have not used something that was completely untraceable? Something, there are far more reliable, effective ways of killing, especially high profile people, such as you can think of a helicopter crash, or maybe even a car crash, or some kind of untraceable substance that causes a heart attack. And goodness knows JFK had enough health problems. It was not really a stretch to imagine that you'd come up with this kind of scenario. There might be a little bit of collateral damage in something like a helicopter crash, but you kind of go, well, you look at what happened, and it's rifles from a distance of hundreds of yards. It's a methodology that had already been deployed against, unsuccessfully on more than one occasion, against Charles de Gaulle in France by the OAS, who had their links to the CIA. As Robin Ramsey argues, this is, forget all that stuff you've read about triangulation of fire and blah, blah, blah. This is a clumsy bushwhack, and it nearly failed. And I think it's a devil's advocate argument. I think he's trying to deliberately, wind us up. But I think it's very valid. I think it's a question that has to be answered. And the problem is that, I've had my own interactions and fallings out or collisions with people within the community where there's so much sectarianism within the research community that if you start to ask these questions, you get labeled as being, are you some kind of, are you infiltrating, or are you, God knows, are you some kind of agent provocateur? And it's like, well, no, I think if you really want to rigorously try and prove this, then you've got to actually answer these questions. You've got to try and provide more than just a hunch. You've got to really kind of get into the kind of architecture and the design and the inner workings, the plumbing, the labyrinth that is all of this. The stuff we touched on earlier with the design of the plot that was deliberately incorporated into it, and it unfurled in such a way that it leads to, basically a shutdown of the investigation through kind of blackmail. Similarly, yeah, I mean, was this deliberately contrived? Did they choose, if this was being carried out by cutouts such as Cuban exiles and mafia, then, this kind of modus operandi, perhaps it makes sense. You don't want to do something that is perhaps too clinical, because that might be suspicious. Who knows what their thinking was? And actually carrying it out in this way is unreliable, but they did, of course, manage to pull it off. And it does lead to these questions. I think, Robin Ramsey says something like, it basically smacks of people who were desperate and who couldn't get close enough to do anything else. And that's a very convincing argument, I have to say.
As as someone who has interviewed some people, I'm speaking about you. Who was your most memorable one? Like, who was the one for you that was kind of like, I don't know, just changed your whole thinking on either covert operations or the Kennedy assassination or things of that sort?
A very good question, Robbie. I probably need to take a bit of time to think about it, but I think interviewing, I think Dan Hardway, who was one of the investigators during the House investigation, the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 70s, which of course concluded, as we said earlier, that the Kennedy assassination was a probable conspiracy. In 1979, the last word, if you like, of the US government on the subject. I think he was very interesting because decades on, in Gaten Fonzie's seminal book, The Last Investigation, Fonzie was also a House investigator alongside Dan Hardway. Fonzie, there's this incredible scene in A Fog of Smoke where both Fonzie and Hardway interview Phillips, and they've done their homework. Phillips comes in perhaps a tad complacent, arrogant. He's the kind of proverbial spook. He's dressed, immaculately in a suit, polished shoes. And these kids, almost, if you like, who are kind of just still, I think, at university or just graduated. Fonzie was slightly different background, but Hardway and Lopez and others, they were basically law students, graduates at the time, quite young. They'd done their homework, and they interview Phillips kind of informally, and they demonstrate to him that that various groups and assets that were being run by the CIA all come out with these strange stories in the immediate aftermath of the assassination that Castro did it. These Castro did it stories that were being pushed by the DRE, by Alpha 66, by other groups, and that in almost every case that these assets could be traced back not just to the not really to the Miami station, but to HQ, to kind of Langley, and that they could be linked to Phillips. And Phillips becomes very nervous, very shaken. He lights up a second cigarette and then a third cigarette at the same time. He's kind of got two cigarettes on the ashtray and he forgets. And it's a moment where they think they've basically nailed him, that he's completely shaken to the core because they've exposed that this house of cards can just fall apart. And then Hardway, I interview him, last year it must have been, and he now says, he goes, well, yeah, I feel a bit, basically, just paraphrasing, I can't quote him verbatim off the record, because, well, off the cuff, because I got the recording elsewhere, but he basically says, well, yeah, I'm not sure now, because Phillips was a very good actor. It comes back to our earlier point about the links between kind of acting and writing and media. Edward Lansdale as well worked in advertising. The links between these kind of areas and spycraft. He says he was a very good actor. I think he may have been engaging in some kind of performance to try and convince me that he was involved. And that's kind of...
With his fiction books, did he ever write anything that seems eerily similar to what would be a government operation? Like afterwards, did he continue writing and trying, like, because I would think, like, geez, the stuff you must have been doing from the stuff we've already found out about what the government was up to, I'd have to be like, this is too good not to put in a book. But I'm just gonna say, change a few names and maybe make it on a different, I don't know, more sci-fi, just so it kind of can get put out in a book and be like a bestseller. Because some of this stuff, like the poison pills to Castro, the skin diving suit, that type of stuff, you're just like, that sounds straight out of a movie or something. That's like it's too insane to think about. But it shows how creative the CIA is, where they just let their guys run loose, probably on whatever Adderall or something, just start going at it.
Yeah, it's crazy stuff. Obviously, all the Castro, how many 600 plus Castro?
They say that, but again, I'm in the area now where I'm really trying, and this is a good question for you, but where do you try and find what can be rationally explained when you understand certain operations, and then what is actually real crazy conspiracy stuff? A lot of the stuff with Oswald in the Dallas and all that can be chalked up to Dallas police being very corrupt, and all they cared about was their conviction ratings. So not giving him the time for a lawyer, not doing certain things and going against his rights doesn't mean they were all involved in some grand conspiracy. Like even Jesse Curry, I think towards the end he was talking, he did not believe the official theory, but then he's on Johnson's plane when the famous wink photograph is taken. Nobody knows that. Look in the back, he's right back there. He's looking over some dude's shoulder. I'm like, wait a minute, that's Jesse Curry on
Is
Air
it? Okay,
Force
I didn't know
One.
that.
Yeah.
Okay, that's very interesting. Yeah, I think it him who later kind of said, yeah, I think he's the one, isn't he, who said he thought it was a
And
conspiracy.
Hoover ruined his career.
Yeah. Oh, really?
Yeah, Hoover went after him, like got the whole press to all start writing articles about Jesse Curry and calling him a nut job and who's very corrupt and just was a worse insult to the police department or something like that. I had to change my perspective on him once I learned that. I was like, damn, I was like, Hoover went after him too. It was like there was another guy, the guy who killed Dillinger took the credit for it. He's part of the FBI, but he talked about taking a piece of cloth and dapping it in Dillinger's blood because Dillinger was killed like outside of a theater or something. And he said that he was grabbing it and passing it around to the other FBI agents. He said that to the press, this guy. And so this guy is getting all the credit for killing Dillinger when it was Hoover that wanted the credit. So Hoover fired him. And then this guy starts up his own consulting agency as a private detective. And Hoover makes sure he got no clients. Hoover basically got him to the point where the guy shot himself. So that's Hoover for you. But to me, it's just interesting learning that background about like, damn, these people are in our government. And we were like holding them at like high esteem. But do you want those people? Because then you think about what the other governments are doing. Is that going to be safe for you? I don't know.
Yeah. It's power corrupts, doesn't it? It's
Very much so.
might start off innocent, but you'll soon be immersed in.
That's why don't ever give me that power. I'll be doing some dumb shit with it.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think we're. Well, I'm not. We're nowhere near the centers of power yet, are we? So there's no imminent danger of us being corrupted. But yeah, I mean, it goes back. Sorry, yeah, it goes back to your original question, which is, yeah, if you look at the investigations that happen afterwards, yeah, and that whole research community, yes, there's this deliberate misinformation and disinformation that is seeded everywhere. And these strange characters who pop up. If you look at the 1970s and the House investigation, you have people like Marita Lorenz popping up and with all these kind of tall tales and regaling people with these stories. She completely mesmerized Mark Lane, who had offered to be Oswald's lawyer, and was one of the most obviously famous and prominent, researchers who did sterling work. But Marita Lorenz has stories, in the end, in the words of Gaetan Fonzi, they were just sophisticated disinformation, really. That doesn't mean to say everything she said wasn't true, because sophisticated disinformation by its very nature has to contain elements of truth and falsehood. That's how it works. And so, she came out with all these stories. Similarly, I mean, Frank Sturgis, was he involved? Wasn't he involved? Fascinating character. The FBI even said to him, well, if anyone could pull it off, Frank, it's you. Yeah, I mean, Sturgis, slippery character, background as an assassin during, the war. His nickname was Leatherneck. He's a very dark character. He was involved in the Cuban stuff, in Watergate, of course. I think, was he out in Vietnam? I'm not sure. But, he's involved in all of this. And Lorenz, quotes this whole conversation with him where he describes, he's like, you missed out on the big one, killing Kennedy, basically. And, we can get away with all of this kind of thing. We're immune because of national security and so on. So, all of these shady characters who come and go. I mean, Antonio, Vecchiano or Veciana, and the whole Phillips story, that became very prominent again during these investigations back in the late 70s. And now, even as recent as 10 years ago, Veciana finally kind of confesses that Maurice Bishop, this kind of pseudonym, was David Phillips. But you think that's the end of the story. And then now, a few years later, new documents emerge, and Veciana's now actually passed away a few years ago. And you have people like John Newman, who's very highly respected, military background, kind of military historian, who's heavily involved in the case, has written extensively about it. And he makes the argument that Veciana was basically being run by ACSI, by Army Intelligence, and that this whole story might just be, again, sophisticated disinformation. And it comes back to this question about Hardway and Fonzi's interview with Phillips was, and this is my starting point when I embarked on, I'd read Fonzi's work and other work, and I was dead certain that Phillips was involved. That was my starting point. And the remarkable thing was that the further I went into this kind of maze, into this labyrinth, I reached the point where I'm no longer certain that he was involved. I think you can quite plausibly make an argument that he was out of the loop because of the kind of compartmentalized nature of how you run these things. They have to be run very tightly. If you look at the kind of things that Harvey and Helms, talk about, they were kind of paranoid and obsessed with watertight operations and watertight compartmentalization to the point that it's completely sealed. So someone like Phillips, his background. Remember, I mean, according to Veciana, yes, he was involved in assassinations, but his background was what psyops. It was propaganda. That's what he'd done in the Guatemala coup. That's what he'd done, during the Cuban Revolutionary War, Bay of Pigs, Mongoose. That was really his role, was, running various assets. He was connected particularly to kind of media people, journalists. And so those kind of stories in the wake of the assassination, that the Castro did it stories, well, would the Cuban exiles have pushed those stories out anyway, regardless? Yeah, maybe. But, there's a good chance that it was someone like David Phillips, who that's what Hardaway and Fonzie thought at the time after they did this memorable interview with him, and he was very shaken and nervous to the core. They thought, yeah, that's what he was running. He was running the psyops part of the assassination. So I think, it's quite possible someone like Phillips knew very little. He'd just been told something might happen, be ready with some disinformation about, the Cubans did it. And in fact, you have Angleton saying the complete opposite. And, when I spoke to Lisa Pease, I don't know if you've had the chance to interview her, but, she's obviously a very high profile, again, as a researcher and writer who's been doing this for decades. And, she said, well, it's very interesting. Angleton's pushing the line. The Russians did it. Phillips is pushing the line. The Cubans did it. And she says, that tells me that neither of them really knows what's going on. Neither of them is actually in charge of this, which I guess is one way of interpreting it. But yeah, it's quite possible that you can construct scenarios where Phillips either knows very little or is completely out of the loop and is surprised by this. I spoke to, as I say, a retired station chief. I can't probably go into more detail than that, but he has certainly an interest in the subject. And he said, well, if you're going to run something like this, you need about 15 to 20 operatives, and these are people who trust each other. We're talking trusting, to the point of life and death, and they've worked together before. And then that's the pattern you see with these people. With pick and choose who you think is in and out, but the likes of Hunt, Phillips, Angleton, Harvey, Morales. These were people who, that whole clique of who were in the kind of what was called at the time, the Directorate of Plans. I mean, under Helms and ultimately under the likes of Dulles. I mean, they'd worked together on Guatemala, on Cuban operations, Bay of Pigs, Mongoose. Later, many of them worked together again in Vietnam and in Chile and so on. So I think they trusted each other intimately. I think you've got the details of, at the end of the day, of every single individual who might or might not have been involved is perhaps academic. It's perhaps immaterial, but I think you've got the right group of people who were guilty, and in fact, who pretty much all of them effectively confess. This is a very interesting thing psychologically. Is at the end of their lives, these people, very different. They get to the end of their lives, and Angleton. Have you ever come across Angleton's deathbed confession, where he's dying of lung cancer? Well, it's written up primarily in a book by one of his kind of journalist kind of confidants, whose name has now bypassed me, but it's then later, in David Talbot's fantastic book, The Devil's Chessboard, I think right at the end actually of the book, where basically Angleton says, we were doing the devil's work. It wasn't God's work. This was the devil's work. Myself and Dulles and Helms and Carmel Offey and all these people, it was tremendous fun. But he was a staunch Catholic, and what he was confronting was the trepidation, the fear, the guilt of facing eternal damnation. And he says, I'm probably, I guess I'll be meeting them in hell, is what he says. And it's the most incredible confession. And so that was Angleton. I mean, Angleton said to the kind of world-renowned Seymour Hersh, he said to him, talking about the agency and about compartmentalized operations, he said, a mansion has many rooms. I'm not privy to who killed Jack, basically. So, and Hersh interpreted that as saying, well, he was trying to basically tell me to look elsewhere. But, interestingly, Angleton doesn't say, oh, well, the CIA didn't do it. He says someone else in the CIA did it. That's basically what he's saying. Phillips, again, says to Kevin Walsh, one of the House investigators, he says, again, you can ascribe this all to being kind of circumstantial and hearsay. But, his last word on the subject was, that this was likely, that it was a conspiracy, likely involving American intelligence officers. That was Phillips's, off the kind of record final take on the subject. And in fact, Phillips, to back that up, you talk about, did he write any of this stuff up? Well, yeah, he wrote a lot of books when he retired. He wrote 2 memoirs. He wrote a novel. Um, uh, with a lot of this, crazy shenanigans in them. He wrote other books. He kind of wrote a kind of spy tradecraft manual, which kind of a how to be a spy guide. Kind of, it's all a bit silly. He did quite a bit of journalism. He did media appearances. He did the kind of lecture circuit. But he also had a manuscript for another novel, which never got completed or published. But in there is some very interesting stuff and a very interesting paragraph where he talks about Oswald, and he basically says, well, Oswald, we trained him up to be a Castro assassin, and I don't know, he obviously went crazy and he turned the whole plan against Kennedy. I don't know why he did that, and so for that reason, myself and the CIA, we weren't guilty, but we take responsibility for it. So, this is obviously thinly disguised kind of auto-fiction. You can always use that as your get out of jail card if you're Phillips. But, it's very strange stuff to be writing. And again, Harvey, we've come across the quotes of not just the quotes, his handwritten notes on how to run an assassination, later the kind of quotes attributed to his deputy. All of these people effectively confessed. Morales, again, hearsay, but he confessed to, two of his friends. He said, well, we got that, we killed that son of a bitch. He used to get drunk and very indiscreet. That may have led to his own death, his own demise. But
I wonder
he
why
said,
all of them were alcoholics. I really do. I think it's because they did so much evil. That's the only way they can get through with like sleeping
yeah,
at
well,
night.
this comes back to the point of in their youth or in their prime, they were kind of full of this, full of spunk and full of
Full of vinegar is what they were.
full
They
of
weren't getting laid. They were full of vinegar.
yeah. No, I mean, well, a lot of them were womanizers as well, weren't they? But what I mean is they were, in men of this nature in their prime, or even men in general, are just full of vigor, full of all of this, full of conviction, fanatical, kind of cold warrior, anti-communists. But by the time they were, in middle age or in old age, those fires had dwindled. And suddenly, you get these confessions, and you also get a desire to, hey, I want some credit. This was like the biggest thing that ever happened. I want to go down in the history books, kind of thing. Cord Meyer, whose wife, ex-wife.
It's the only reason I believe the theory that the Watergate burglary was intended to fail is because you had all those CIA guys involved in it, or ex-CIA or some type of military connections involved in the break-in, and they get caught by taping a door, and they get the tape caught, the guy takes it off, and then they reapply it to the door. Where I go, this is not like they have operational experience. Why are they? Cord Meyer was a part of that. So it was like, why are they doing such stupid things to get caught unless they wanted to get caught? And then you really look at, like you mentioned, Cord Meyer's wife dying. Um, I forgot her name. It's Mary Meyer, Mary Panay Meyer, right? And they blamed some guy who was fishing or something like that, who happened to jump in after his fishing rod, he said, and that's why he was soaking wet, and they thought he was running or something like that. I did a clip about it for the YouTube, and it got flagged, surprisingly. That and Jim Cothey got flagged. They said harmful conspiracy theories. I go, wait, Jim Cothey, well, Jim Cothey got a throat chop. That's proven. That's in his autopsy. That's the only one in the assassination that Larry Hancock deems suspicious. And YouTube's like, that's a harmful conspiracy. I was like, I even pulled the footage of his actual, like the actual death when they're pulling the body out. It's on YouTube. You can watch it. They're in it's a whole actual, someone was filming when Jim
Sorry,
Cothey
who
was
is this
found.
guy?
Jim Cothey.
I mean, what was his
He was a
background?
Dallas Times Herald who the night that Jack Ruby shot Oswald, he went with police to Jack Ruby's apartment, and he was going to write a book about the assassination. He was a lot like what's her
Dorothy.
name?
Dorothy
Dorothy
Kilgallen.
Kilgallen. Yeah, he was a lot like her. Except he literally says that everything that's going on, we're being lied to. And then his official death autopsy was while stepping out of his showers, he had received a blunt force chop to his throat. So there wasn't like a thing that fell on him. There wasn't any of that. The official thing is death by karate chop. And that's what I literally titled it, and I showed the documentation, like,
The certificate. Yeah.
yeah, I have my little shorts and I do like the documentation. I showed everything with proof, and they
Mm.
flagged it for harmful conspiracy theory.
Of
And I was
course,
like, I was
yes.
like, yeah, but I mean, when does all the JFK stuff go away? They already put a disclaimer on it. Is this eventually just not become a subject we can ever talk about, even though it's impacted, I think, everybody's life at some point?
Well, this is part of it, isn't it? It goes back to this point about the sophisticated disinformation. Is that you end up having I call them kind of real conspiracies and fake conspiracies. You've got those situations where clearly any rational kind of reasonable person has to say that, hey, the official version of the Kennedy assassinations, of these all these kind of coups, regime change operations up till the present day, Watergate, Iran Contra. Anyone reasonable has to say, well, there's a hell of a lot more to this. And then you've got your, what appear to be just fake, ridiculous conspiracies, things like, I mean, you name them, whatever it might be, reptilian DNA or um, uh,
Yeah,
chemtrails,
but
whatever it might be.
you,
But you lump them all together. That's the effect in the end: is that you delegitimize, you discredit the things, those things that are key. What I think Peter Dale Scott calls deep events. They are mysterious events which have actually a geopolitical impact, and that's why they're kind of such big events. But yeah, I mean the effect is that you lump any of those kind of things, the kind of false flags, Gladio, northwards, the kind of false flags for wars such as WMD in Iraq or the Gulf of Tonkin in Vietnam. These are things that all should, alongside the assassinations and so on, they should be, any kind of serious, high-minded, whether it's researcher, journalist, or just member of the public, should be interested in interrogating these things. And yet you've got these kind of ridiculous things being put out there. And the effect, of course, is that those ridiculous things, if you lump it all into one category and call it conspiracy theory, wacko stuff, the effect is to kind of delegitimize, to discredit wider public debate and discussion on these subjects. And I mean, JFK, he was effectively betrayed, wasn't he? Here was this glamorous, young, good-looking, vigorous, charismatic president who kind of represented the hopes of a new generation in the 60s, who represented these new beginnings. And he was a liberal icon. He was, considered a progressive. He was loved by the public and by many millions of people across the globe, and that impact is felt to this day. And yet, yeah, it's remarkable. The New York Times, the Washington Post, I mean, even his friends, Ben Bradley, etc. I mean, they just go to sleep on this. This liberal icon is just completely, his death and his assassination is just completely whitewashed and ignored by the very liberal establishment that he belonged to. It's very odd. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. I mean, what's his name? Governor John Conley, who was obviously in the motorcade with him, got shot. He said in an interview, that was filmed, I think, for the 30th anniversary or something. He said, "Yeah, we just, there was just it was such a traumatic moment and wound for the country that we just wanted closure." And that's why Conley never believed that he'd been shot by the magic bullet. He was adamant that it was different bullets, which immediately makes the whole lone assassin theory just throws it out the window, doesn't it? But yeah, I mean, he said, I didn't want to reopen all of this because I felt the country just needed to heal. It needed closure, needed to move on. I mean, I think you and I will have a very different idea of what healing and closure really is. I don't think it's just ignoring the truth and moving on from it, but that's how people felt. And Charles de Gaulle said the same thing. He said, look, they will do everything they can to kind of to basically forget it.
Well, no matter
see.
what your
Watch.
theory is on who did it in the assassination, the fact that you cannot talk about it without some type of stigma to it. And even I've had like people from the Skeptic Society of all those people that debunk conspiracies. When I just mentioned like real conspiracies, and if they called me a conspiracy theorist, I had one guy be like, "Yeah, I consider you a conspiracy theorist." And I was like, "Well, let me ask you, like conspiracy as in looking into MK Ultra?" And he's like, I haven't heard of that. He's like, and then I try to explain it to him, and he's like, that sounds made up. But I'm like, that's the thing. We've lost the discussion now. We don't teach it. It's like Unit 731 on Japan's side, that horrible group that's way worse than the Nazis that vivisectioned, and I think they killed more Chinese than Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. And the only reason we don't talk about them is because we agreed with Japan that we wouldn't ever mention it in our history books as long as they gave us certain research information. And it's like Japan doesn't talk about it. It's like a blackball, but China holds it against Japan. So it's real. China knows about it. Everyone knows about it. But just Google Unit 731. That was the worst thing. They take a pregnant woman and they would vivisection her from the bottom up, and they would take somebody's arm, cut it off without any anesthesia, and sew it to the other side. And they would just mess around. That's what they would do. They were horrible people, but you can't, nobody knows about them. Nobody talks about them. Very few people that have looked into World War I or World War II will ever come across anything that relates to Japanese military. And you start getting into that aspect of like, wait a minute, did we just lose a whole chunk of history because nobody wants to talk about it because we made some type of deal or we got information from them, so we agreed not to talk about their horrible act that they did? I mean, to me, I don't know. I mean, I like talking about this stuff because I want to better understand what's real and what's not. But the fact that the public is so divided on, like, let's take the Kennedy assassination, any Northwoods, that when that came up in the 60th anniversary, or was it the year before, everyone was calling that a conspiracy. It wasn't real. It was all fake. So do we just rewrite history? Do we just go back and go, no, all this stuff that we have been proven and are significant events to show how bad government can go to, we just call it a conspiracy and don't talk about it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is a whole. Perhaps we should write a book about it, Robbie, because it's an incredible,
What, call it how fucked we are? Because that's what we can call it.
an incredible. I mean, it's an incredible subject. Is what you're touching on, because way beyond the Kennedy assassination, way beyond, way beyond all of these things is we're starting. I mean, my politics are slightly different, but you look at the kind of populist, or I guess it's a misnomer, you'd probably call them, some of them, fake populist movements, but you look at these kind of movements across the world, and we're in a very interesting, pivotal, kind of critical, seismic moment. And the things that have happened over the last few years, and with the emergence, of course, of the internet and social media, has amplified all of this, is that larger numbers of people are becoming skeptical and cynical about the mainstream version of mainstream kind of sources of information and the mainstream version of reality that they're being peddled. And that I think can be traced right back to the Kennedy assassination. And there's even data to back that up from the Pew Research Center, where you can see that from 1964 onwards, there is a gradual, almost inexorable decline of kind of faith in US government institutions. There's a few ups and downs, but it's essentially a downward trajectory, and a catastrophic decline. And I didn't think, and that, not just the Kennedy assassination, but all the successive events over those decades, Watergate leading to the downfall of a president, leading to the downfall of Nixon, the Vietnam War, Iran-Contra in the 80s, this century, 9/11, even if you accept or don't accept whatever version of that, it leads to the war on terror, Iraq, Afghanistan. You come into the kind of Snowden NSA scandal. You've got all of this whole narrative that unfolds over decades. And, particularly in this century, I think something like the Iraq War, going to a war in which there was a false flag of WMD, and, that was never, of course, never found. and that has led to a huge, backlash. And that's, it's, you look at the Trump movement, whether you agree or disagree with it. The point is that a lot of these people, and it's the same with Brexit here in the UK or other movements in Europe and elsewhere, is that people are, larger numbers of people are no longer prepared to just accept this, and they're looking elsewhere. They're looking at alternative, internet media news sources, alternative outlets, and this is what's led to the kind of censorship you're talking about that you've experienced directly, the censorship of the internet through,
it sounds so
search.
stupid though, and because like I have so many friends that go, "Oh, my book's blacklisted or I'm shadow banned," and I'm like, "All right, dude, like you're that like what the hell?" And I don't even talk about it, but I have been shadow banned. I've had multiple people send me a JFK clip. And they'll be like, I liked it. And then you'll see it has one like, but I've got screenshots from all my friends that have like, they all liked it. So at least out of all my friends that have sent it to me, it would be at least the minimum 15 likes. But there's just one like on there. And then I go, okay, well, I'm not going to say I'm important enough to be shadow banned. But then I had a video that had 50,000 likes, but then 20,000 views, where I'm like, how the fuck does that happen? And you find out that they just started removing view counts to the video, and I recorded it on my phone. You saw all the hearts popping up of like people liking it, but then if you look at the views, it got reset all the way to 0. Where I was like, apparently I have 50,000 likes on this post, but nobody's seen it. So sorry, but it's a JFK stuff, and that's where the real thing is. And you got to really question about like what eventually, if I tell somebody, because I get so tired of explaining it, I say, before we talk about the Kennedy assassination, pull your phone out. And they'll pull their phone out. And I do this with all my friends. I go, Google this. Gerald Ford edited a report to move the back wound of JFK's back wound up 6 inches to the back of the throat. They look it up, it's there. And they go, what? And I go, exactly. Did you know he also edited the Rockefeller report to make sure the CIA's activities that they were doing wasn't ever going to get released? And they looked that up, see that. And I go, okay, if I can get you there on that, then listen to the rest of the things and just understand that I don't have to cite a document. I could just tell you what I've seen. I'm going to tell you factually,
Yeah.
this is what it is. But
Well, I
eventually,
mean,
you're not going to be able to Google it on your phone.
yeah, I mean, the CIA has already admitted that it was engaged in at least a benign cover-up of the Kennedy assassination, and by that they
Somewhat.
mean that they were trying to hide their other nefarious activities, namely Mongoose and the, Castro assassination plot and all of that.
It's
So,
like you got the cusp of diabetes. You don't have it yet, but you got the
yeah,
cusp of it. I'm like, oh,
yeah,
thanks.
you're a pre-conspiracy theorist. I mean, yeah, it's yeah. I mean, I think it's hard to predict how this is going to unfold in terms of the civic sphere, the public sphere. But yeah, I think it's an absolutely pivotal moment. And of course, now compared to a few years ago, if you YouTube certain things, Google things, if you actually looked up JFK assassination stuff or other kind of other similar kind of covert events, you would find incredible stuff. And now it is much harder. There's clearly, how are they doing, your kind of the stuff that you've seen with your own work. I mean, I suspect that there must be algorithms and there must be certain subject areas where they are, they're clearly applying these algorithms to censor it. I'm not a tech bro, so I can't
Well, they
work
update
out,
their terms and services a lot, and every time they update it, you can't retroactively cancel somebody or take down a video. The video I got taken down and got a flag for, where I couldn't post for a week, was all about, I mean, that was months ago, and they just updated their conspiracy section now on YouTube, where I was like, look, I get it's your platform, but you can't, if the rules weren't invented yet, you can't go back at me for something that I didn't know I was violating at the time. It's like kind of like I mean, Dr. Phil mentioned this, which was really interesting, but he's like, it's like, blaming people for something that happened, like, oh, you didn't like what we're saying right now. 20 years from now could be completely horrible, and it could that shouldn't affect us later in life because we don't know. We're in the moment as it is now. I can't think what 20 years from now it's going to be like in society. It's unpredictable. But they do that on all these sites now. Everybody's updating all their terms and services, and they're like, "Oh, you violated this 5 years ago," and it's like, "Well, that rule was created today. That was 5 years ago. I didn't know it was going to be a rule," and it's like, too bad.
yeah. tough. Yeah, it's
Wait till they hit your books. Next thing you know, you're going to release your book and it's going to be like, nope, can't ever talk about David Atlee Phillips. You're like, fuck, I read a whole book about him.
yeah. I mean, it's. I don't think you can really win with that approach, though. I mean, as in, I think, yeah. I mean, I did freelance journalism quite extensively for a number of years, mainly in the last decade. But yeah, I mean, it's yeah, you find it's very hard to go up against against those in power. It's very hard to speak truth to power, and that's been the case throughout history. It remains the case to this day. But I think we are in a very interesting moment, and I think it all starts with the Kennedy assassination in terms of modern history, in terms of this gradual understanding that the public is developing about the true kind of covert, hidden, secretive workings of power, and a lot of things that were exposed in the 70s. I mean, Angleton, I think it was Harvey, who described what was going on in the 70s with those government investigations, the Church Committee and the House Select Committee and so on. I think Harvey wrote to Angleton that he defined it as the kind of the Cromwellian definition of treason. And of course, from their perspective, it was precisely that. From our perspective, it was the truth. But from their perspective, that's what it was. They considered it, Angleton infamously said, you can't honestly expect that basically an intelligence organization, a secret agency such as ourselves should comply with every, government order or edict. It's just completely inconceivable. So that was their perspective, of course, is that in order to do what they were doing, in order to run things as they were, that and that's of course there are some, even Julian Assange argues some secrets have to remain secret for a state. Of course, I think that presumably
There are secrets that are for protection, and there's secrets that threaten the words democracy. And I think if you really truly live in a democracy, I'm a patriot at heart. I tell people that all the time. And they always go, "But you're always criticizing the government." I was like, because I know we can do better on so much. And a lot of the terms that they have, like national security, that has been put on many things that have damaged the lives of many Americans and many other people overseas, all under the terms of national security. But you can't put that on that if you're not truly following what your directive of national security was. And I think you stand in the same stance where I stand, where you just want to know things, but at the same time, you also want to speak out if you see corruption. And I think a lot of these agencies eventually just kind of gave us the illusion of free will. And many things now are kind of just set up. And, if you don't question, I mean, the mainstream news is losing viewers, not because of alternative media. It's because all they do is report on who got new boobs. Like nobody is in, some people are, but there's like, I don't know if you ever see Candace Owens when she was on, CNN. And they asked her, they literally lined her up with one of those hardcore, like, I'm going to target you questions to make you look bad on air. And they go, what's your evidence that Ukraine is corrupt? And she was like, your fucking articles. You put them out 2 years ago before Ukraine was, you guys were all supporting them, and just showed it. And they had it on live television. So they had to cut away from her. And it was like, yeah, it shows them that they don't care. They're all crapping on Ukraine at one moment, and then when Ukraine gets into this war, they all start supporting them. You got to understand that, like, do you want to watch something that's fake 24/7, then watch the news? Or if you want to get people's real honest perspectives, you just talk to them and you figure out that you learn that a lot of people probably agree with most of the things you agree with. You might have some slight differences politically, but then you enhance the discussion. You should be able to ask each other questions and not get mad at each other if you have different theories about the Kennedy assassination or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, it's incredible that, I mean, I experienced it even when I was doing something you would think is relatively uncontroversial, which was my first book on what we have here in terms of, our universal healthcare system, the NHS, and how that's being deliberately dismantled, destroyed, privatized. I mean, I think over there stateside, you're having some very interesting campaigns and movements to bring about universal healthcare. So we're going to meet you in the middle. Perhaps we're going in the wrong direction, you're going in the right direction. But, you'd think that is relatively uncontroversial. And yet that you would talk about, the NHS here is being privatized, our healthcare system is being privatized. And you would have people saying to you, that's a conspiracy theory, or this is just, batshit crazy stuff. And it's just, my God, you think if that is enough to warrant that kind of response, then God help us, when you're trying to deal with, a presidential assassination or a regime change or a coup or a war or whatever it might be. So yeah. I mean, it's and also there's a process of kind of institutional memory and of these organizations kind of learning from it. If you look at what happened in Iraq, almost, it was so what's the word I'm looking for? Transparently ridiculous. I mean, I remember, okay, I'm perhaps more skeptical than most, but I remember being at the time in my early 20s and thinking, oh, this is just blatantly nonsense. This is just, it's so clear that war is not, this is not the last resort. Like, there is room to do so many other things before we reach this point of launching a war. And it was clear that, it's just like, oh, this is just blatant nonsense. It's lies. And of course, that myself and others tragically were all vindicated. But you go then fast forward 10 years to Syria, or now to Ukraine, and it's much cleverer the way that these kind of events, operations, whatever you call it, are being conducted. They're being done in this kind of plausibly deniable way, and to try, and it leads to such division and divisiveness. If you try to have a discussion, I think it's you talk about Iraq, I think most people will go, oh yeah, that was a kind of a illegal, immoral war. It shouldn't have happened. But that's not the response if you start to bring up some of these other subject areas, and you kind of go, oh well, you know what, the same thing's actually going on here, but it's being done in this way. We're arming and funding these kind of crazy extremist groups, and trying to engage in regime change or whatever, or actually, and that stuff is, we'll know. It's you read up. I now read up about the stuff that Phillips was involved in Guatemala. It's just mind blowing. I mean, the kind of news propaganda, media propaganda stuff that was being put out there about Arbans in Guatemala. This guy was just a leftist. He was not a communist. He was not. He was not in league with the Kremlin. He just wanted to engage in some moderate reforms to modernize his kind of dirt poor country, and to try and free it from the kind of tentacles of United Fruit. And the stories that were being put out there at the time, in the kind of American press, but worldwide, I mean, stuff about massacres and about him and his government were engaging in corrupt practices and really immoral stuff involving girls, and it's just like, wow, it was just all lies basically. And you kind of think about, well, what's what you're reading day in, day out. You talk about Project Mockingbird, there's no doubt that's still going on, that kind of stuff. And you just, I think things have certainly, in my lifetime, things have got worse. I remember a time not that long ago, perhaps 15 years ago, where if you looked at our liberal media outlets, they were more open. Someone like, people like ourselves could have, much more easily pitched a piece or an article to those media outlets and to publishers and literary agencies and stuff. I'm not saying that there wasn't any resistance and propaganda and censorship going on. Of course there was, but it was not to the degree that it is now. And I mean, today, for me to try and submit a proposal for this Phillips book to an agency or to a publisher, or to pitch pieces, I was writing mainly for The Independent. In the end, that gig, I was that effectively was terminated, that gig. And I later discovered from my editor that she'd been told by kind of senior management that they didn't want my articles to be published. There was no specific reason given, and I suppose a publisher always has the right to do that at the end of the day. But it was clearly because I was touching on quite controversial material, and it all came after this kind of Seymour Hersh interview. I mean, since when is the interviewer blamed for what the interviewee says? But it all came to a head after that, a piece where he'd been kind of on a book tour with his autobiography, and I kind of happened to catch him on the phone, and he was in a particularly, I think, gregarious mood, and he just let rip on everything from 9/11 to the Russians to this, that, and the other, and the interview, when it got published, it just led to a real backlash from other liberal kind of outlets and kind of intelligentsia, if you like, and so on. So, and soon after that, I was effectively kind of blacklisted, if you like. So yeah, I think that's the situation that post Brexit, post Trump, we find ourselves in. I say post Trump, of course, he's going to be. It's not necessarily from your perspective, but that's the situation I think we find ourselves in. There's this.
Wait, you don't think I'm Republican, do you?
No. I mean,
Okay,
as in
okay.
he's going to be running most likely as the Republican nominee.
I don't
So
vote. I hope everybody knows
no.
that.
As in,
Okay.
I said post-Trump, it's not over, is it? So what I mean is that after those kind of earthquakes that have happened over the past 10 years, I think that's when there's been this deliberate decision by, by the establishment, by Silicon Valley, etc., to censor the internet, because otherwise they realized that really they're going to lose control and lose power, that people are getting access on the internet and being able to communicate and to organize and to generalize and escalate movements on a scale that was unthinkable. Basically, that had become the tool. And whether it was the Arab Spring or Brexit, Trump, what was going on in other parts of the world across France and Europe and so on. So I'm not saying all of it was good. I think it was in a time of crisis in capitalism, in a time of economic, political, social, ecological crisis. There is inevitably and invariably, in terms of the historical forces and so on, there is a polarization, to the kind of right and left that didn't exist, I think, for those of us who grew up, in a much more quiet, stable, boring time in the 90s. So, yeah. Anyway, I'll probably
No,
have
Youssef,
to
it's been a
get off
pleasure.
my soapbox.
It's been a pleasure chatting with you again, man. You've given me enough of your time. Is there a place where people can find any of your links?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm on Twitter at El-Gingihy, if you can spell it. But alternatively, if you just search my articles that I wrote in independent newspaper in the UK, if you just Google my name and at the Independent, you'll find good kind of 50 articles or so, many of them long reads on some of these subjects.
Well, I'll make sure to link all your links in the description. Youssef, it's been a pleasure chatting with you again. Thanks, everybody, for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.